So, how did I get here? Over the past few weeks, I have been walking you through kind of my process of how I'm setting New Year's resolutions or art goals for myself, and then how I'm going about drawing my little art animals, such as in this case, a fox. But in this episode, it's probably a pretty big turn of me all of a sudden seeming to destroy an illustration that I have been working on for pretty much the whole month of January. So before I get into actually why I'm doing this, I want to talk about something that I heard close to the end of December, and I heard it on TikTok, and if I can find the video clip of it on YouTube, I'll make sure to link it down below. But it was an incredible word of advice, and it just allowed something in my brain to just click. And that is how this entire new series that's going to be on my channel started. So in this little clip, this lady was talking about the difference between passion and basically curiosity when it comes to your art. And for years, I have felt like, honestly, my passion has just kind of dipped. Part of it has been just depression. Part of it has been health issues. Part of it has just been the world is not really a nice place certain times of the year. There's just a lot going on, and trying to find passion in your art is very, very difficult when outside factors are affecting it. But I always felt so, wrong, because I had this job that allowed me to pursue my passion and do what I loved and everything. And I still love doing art, but I just had lost that drive. And I think a lot of artists and a lot of creative people hit this eventually, where it's just like trying to pull teeth to get your passion kind of restarted or sparked up again. And so in this little clip, she said, trying to find passion is very difficult. It's like a mountaintop experience. It's like it happens only once in a small little period of time, and it's not continuous. It's not going to stay with you forever. But you can always pursue curiosity. Every single day that you wake up, you can ask a new question about something that you're working on. You can find something to be curious about and challenge yourself and ask just a general question like, what will happen if I do this to my paper? What will happen if I do this to my paint? Curiosity is always there. You can always ask a new question, which just totally clicked with me because that's actually how I started my watercolor channel. It's just crazy to think how I started was asking questions. And I think I really got away from that curiosity aspect of my art and started to just really hone in on the perfectionism side of it. Like I wanted every painting to be perfect, and I just wanted everything to be a mountaintop experience. And that's not true with art. That's not true in life. And it's definitely not true when you are trying to play around with creative mediums. Especially watercolor, because a lot of times watercolor doesn't give you a lot of control. So sometimes watercolor is going to have a mind of its own on the paper, and you just have to bend with it. Which brings us to where we are right now. Why am I dunking this illustration in water? So for me, in this particular episode, I wanted to do a truth or dare to myself. And in the future, I'm going to be asking y'all for help, like basically doing polls on this channel of, do you want me to do a truth where I talk about a particular supply that I've used over the years, or do you want me to do a dare? For this particular video, I was just going to do a dare for myself to kind of show you the format of what I've been thinking about doing. But the dare was I wanted to take an illustration that I completely inked with a colored ink that I have not actually really used before. This is a new colored ink that I've been playing around with. And I wanted to see if I dunk this in water after I let it dry for like 3 or 4 days to make sure that this thing is set good in the paper. So that's another thing. Always remember that your ink or your paint dries faster than your paper. And if your paper is still wet, your ink on top can still run. So I wanted to make sure that that was not a factor when I was playing around with this. So I let this thing dry for like 3 to 4 days before I actually dunked it in water. And what I wanted to see was, first off, does the ink run? Does it stay in place? And then I wanted to basically try and abuse this paper, push it beyond its limit. So really soak this paper overboard with water, and then try painting on it loosely and then see if I could actually correct with mixed media, specifically like colored pencils, as well as maybe some gouache, some other ink supplies that I have, some pencils, graphite pencils. Could I take something that I basically ruined and then fix it so that at the end of the illustration, it looks decent? So that's what I wanted to tackle in this particular challenge, or this particular dare, was dunk this piece of paper and lose basically all control and then see if I could fix it. What's great about this particular challenge is that if something happens while I'm painting in the future with an illustration that I don't necessarily want to mess up, I can take the lessons that I learned from this and apply them to that particular painting. So basically it's an exercise of how do I correct myself if I have a big goof and I don't want to start over completely with a new painting. I want to just try and salvage what I already have down. And as you have probably already seen, the ink did not stay, but I find it very interesting. The ink did stay in places where the pencil groove was. So if I scored the paper, the ink actually did stay in those particular areas, but anything that was on the outside of that score, or basically that small indent where the pencil had created an indent in the paper, the ink actually did bleed away. So this ink is not permanent if you soak it with a lot of water. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're painting with this particular color. If you're painting next to it with a lot of water, it actually might be better to lay this ink down after you do maybe a wet and wet with a lot of water on your paper than before, because just keep in mind this is going to bleed. So that was the first part of my challenge. Now the second part of my challenge is, can I recover this after pretty much abusing this paper? So this particular paper is only 140-pound watercolor paper, and it's cold press, so it can take a little bit more abuse than, let's say, hot press paper. But that being said, it still was definitely pushed to its limits because I completely soaked and dunked this particular paper. So the first thing that I did is just allowed my paints to kind of mingle on the paper and let them flow however they wanted to. Since the paper is so wet, they're basically going to blossom and bleed out into random shapes and spirally tendrils, and I'm going to let it happen. I'm just going to allow the paint to do whatever it wants to do. Now, for those of you who've watched me for years, you know that I'm not a really big loose watercolor painter. I like to have my things very much sharp edges and very much in control. So I paint a lot of my illustrations in wet on dry rather than wet on wet. So this is very much a challenge for me because I am basically forcing myself to paint in a technique that I honestly don't really like to paint in. So once I got that base color basically down with all the oranges and yellows for my fox fur, I let this completely dry. So this time I let this thing sit once again for 3 to 4 days. I have not been able to use my blow dryer or my heat gun because I have been basically doing this while my son is sleeping. So I've just allowed it to kind of sit and then worked on another project while this thing air dries. And once these colors finally dried on my paper, it was then time to just try and salvage what I had. So this particular paper, it actually worked really, really well for being dunked in water. It held up really well. I actually was pretty surprised how well it held up after being dunked in water, but you could definitely tell in certain areas of the paper I definitely had overworked or overstressed the paper. So the top of the paper was a lot rougher than really it should have been. So the very first thing that I did was try and deepen the colors of my fox and basically glaze a layer over top just to make those colors a little bit more intense. And then while my paint was still wet, I actually took some colored pencils and tried adding a little bit of scoring as well as color to the paint while it was still wet. So it wasn't soaking wet, but the paper was still damp. So kind of going back to the paint was pretty much dry, but the paper actually was still wet in this case. And what it did is it actually pulled some of the paint off the page, and it actually kind of scored a little bit in a very blunt way, the paper. And it basically allowed me to create kind of a fur look with my color pencils. So I continue to just play around with that particular technique over and over again. I also used an X-Acto knife to kind of score some of my lines again and sharpen them so that when I was painting next to them or even coloring next to them with colored pencils, it created a sharper line or a harsher edge because I was using the X-Acto knife to score my paper. But yeah, I just played around with different colored pencils and different techniques, and I think it turned out pretty nice, to be perfectly honest. I was really surprised how much I pushed myself with this particular painting, and that I was actually able to salvage, in my opinion, this painting, because I really did push this far beyond what I should have. So yeah, that was my dare or challenge for this week. Make sure to definitely follow and like the video, subscribe and all of that stuff. If you want to be involved in the voting process, in the next couple of weeks, I'll be having little polls. I believe I'm going to put them in the community tab for my channel where y'all can vote for future videos and specifically choose different challenges or different things that I talk about, and whichever one basically has the largest amount or wins the poll, that's what I'm going to be doing for future videos. So I want to include all of you in this process as well. So I basically want to just bring y'all along on this journey while I ask questions of myself and tackle different problems that I encounter while I'm painting. And that is why the tagline for this particular year is going to be stay curious, stay creative, and then happy painting. Lots of love, y'all, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!